In one of your YouTube videos, I believe you called the use of nuclear arms by the United States in World War II unjustified. Although I may be mistaken, either way, do you believe that this action was morally correct and or the best choice available to the United States government, and is there a difference between these two things? That's from Colin.
Hey, Colin, how you doing tonight?
Hi, good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Cool.
So, what did you do, just out of curiosity, when you heard about my statement regarding nuclear weapons at the end of Second World War? Did you look anything up? What did you research? Where did it lead you?
Well, I heard that initially, and I had remembered a while ago I had done a school project on it. One of our assignments in the history class was to debate, and in that I had a lot of the research, and so I had familiarized myself a lot with the topic before, but I looked up back into like the sort of both what the effects of the bombing were. I looked into what the proposed alternatives were, what the possibilities of what it could happen if we didn't, and that sort of thing. And then once I had done that, I wrote into the show to talk to you about it.
Okay, so you've described to me the form. I guess I was more interested in the content of what you came up with. So, in your research, why did Japan attack America at Pearl Harbor?
Pearl Harbor, that was a preeminent strike, I believe.
Preemptive, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, but why?
Well, their goal was they believed that U.S. intervention was inevitable, so they wanted to take out the United States Navy before we could really rear the full power against them.
No, I understand that they attacked Pearl Harbor and sunk a bunch of ships because they wanted to disable the U.S. Navy. The question is, why did they do that?
I get what you mean now.
Why did they attack the Navy? Because they wanted to harm the Navy. Let's take that as a given. And why did they want to do it?
Well, for my answer I would give you is because they were an expansionist imperialist power. Would you agree?
Well, sure, but I mean, so many countries are expansionist imperialistic powers. Why at that time, on that day in 1942, did the Japanese, I'm not saying was it justified, I'm asking why did they do it?
What was their rationale in doing so?
Yeah, like at that time.
Oh, as opposed to earlier or later?
Well, yes, and why at all?
Well, I suppose that you could say it's because the Japanese believed that their goals and the goals of the United States were so incompatible that
oh my God, man, of course they had disagreements, but why? What specifically happened? You've done a project on this, you've done research. Why were the Japanese desperate to attack America? And the Navy in particular?
Are you referencing the oil embargo?
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, okay. That had slipped my mind, sorry.
So go ahead.
Oh, go just with the sort of laying out of what I was thinking.
Okay, I guess I'll do it. So Roosevelt had banned all exports of scrap iron, steel, and oil to Japan.
Yes.
And because he didn't like the Japanese invasion of China. So Japan had lost more than 90% of its oil supply. Japan, of course, has no native production of oil. So this, economic isolation that was imposed by the U.S. embargo had crippled Japan's military and its economy as a whole. And Japan looked across at America and said, okay, well, these guys are starving us out. We can't survive as a military power or even as an economic power if this continues. And they looked at America and they said, well, America's been sitting out the war for a couple of years now. They've had a crippling depression that has gone on and on. And so if they're not willing to go to fight to save the British or the French, then they're probably not going to bother doing too much from all of this. And so they figured that if they went and destroyed the Navy in America, then the embargo, of course, would be lifted, and then that the American response would most likely be fairly tepid, right? I mean, they believed that it was not going to be much because they had watched America not get involved in the European war.
Yeah,
so
Hitler believed the same thing when he invaded Poland. He believed there would only be a reprimand from the UK.
Right. So an embargo is an act of war, right? I mean, we understand that. It was a response to American encirclement of the Japanese mainland. Now, this is not to put Japan out of the picture as far as moral responsibility. I just want to bash on America. Japan had invaded China, and the Japanese soldiers were like, holy crap, unbelievably brutal. Just look at how the Japanese soldiers treated, say, Australian prisoners of war. You can read a book called The Rape of Nanking about how the Japanese soldiers treated those they gained control over. And so this was your typical back and forth semi-superpower expansionistic crap. But without a doubt, the embargo, I mean, either Japan was going to knuckle down to American preferences and be crippled economically and militarily, or they had to strike at America. But certainly America had forced their hand in this way.
No, yeah.
All right. Now, what did you learn or read about the atomic bomb and the dropping of it?
Oh, the use of
and
it.
How that decision was made.
Well, I know that it was made primarily. Well, it was given the sign off by Harry Truman, who it's popular knowledge here. I don't know how much if it's as popular knowledge in Canada, but he only knew about it essentially the day that he was asked whether or not he should drop it. I know it had been in development for quite some while. It had been supposed to be the only thing that could break the Bushido spirit of Japan. And obviously the human impact was immense of the bombing.
Right. Okay. Do you know what the military thought of this particular bombing? Some of the top-ranking brass?
Like what their opinions were on the use of the weapon?
Yes.
Well, I know that MacArthur was kind of gung-ho about it. I know that he was in support of the idea because when they planned land invasions, the casualties they counted out were so vast that they supposed that it would have been a much better alternative to use the bomb.
Well, I would like to see a source for that because that's not the information.
That's not what you have?
No. So I'll sort of run through it very briefly. So okay. Secretary of War Henry Stimson.
Yes.
He informed Dwight Eisenhower, who's general, of course, in charge of the army, said the bomb was going to be dropped in Japan. Mm-hmm. So Eisenhower wrote an autobiography called Mandate for Change. And Eisenhower related this exchange. He said, I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. And secondly, because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. It was my belief that Japan was, at that very moment, seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face. Mm-hmm. So this is Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, this is the guy, right, as far as Second World War military. So this is from The Pathology of Power by Norman Cousins. He said, when I asked General MacArthur about the decision to drop the bomb, I was surprised to learn he had not even been consulted. Right, General MacArthur.
I must have been consulted. Now that I think about that, I was conflating his opinions in Japan with his in Korea. Actually.
Okay. He said, what I asked what his advice had been. He replied that he saw no military justification for the dropping of the bomb. The war might have ended weeks earlier, he said, if the United States had agreed, as it later did anyway, to the retention of the institution of the emperor. Now, so what he's referring to here is that the Japanese, obviously, like most people, but maybe even a little bit more than most, are interested in sort of saving face and all that kind of stuff, right? And yes. Looking all right. So the Japanese said, before the bombs were dropped, before either of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were dropped, the Japanese had informed the American government that they were willing to surrender, unconditionally with one exception, which was they wished to retain the emperor. They wished to retain the emperor on his throne. Mm-hmm. Now, the American government said, no, you can't have the emperor, unconditional surrender, top to bottom, we can dictate everything. Now, how did that work out with the Germans after World War I, with the Versailles Treaty and we'll impose whatever we'll want. Well, it created a huge number of problems, some of which undoubtedly led to the Second World War.
Could I interject for a second?
Sure.
Well, one of the large problems that a lot of historians associate with the Weimar German situation was the lack of the democratic tradition in Germany, right? Have you heard that theory?
Germany was a democracy under the Weimar Republic.
No, what I'm saying is the reason why Germans eventually rejected democracy and moved to National Socialism was because of their limited, truly democratic history.
No, I'm not going down. Hang on, I'm sorry. That'd have to be a whole separate conversation. I don't want to go down that road. In particular, like the rise of Nazism and all that. So let's just do one historical myth at a time.
The reason why I bring that up, though, is because I think
no. Unless it's completely directly relevant and we don't even have an answer for it, let's just continue with what we're talking about and not go over to Germany.
I think it is relevant, though.
Okay, go ahead.
The reason why I believe it's relevant is because I think the United States government had reason to fear that if they left the emperor in power, even as a figurehead, it would make the Japanese more rejective of a democratic tradition. Obviously, that's not true.
Oh my God, no, and I'll tell you why. I'm sorry, that's just wildly incorrect. Okay. So the Japanese said, "We'll surrender everything. You can tell us everything about everything, but we wish to retain the emperor." And the Americans said no, and then they bombed the shit out of generally innocent civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, they'd already firebombed the shit out of Tokyo, which had created a firestorm that killed staggering numbers of people. If I remember rightly, the immediate death count of the firestorm bombing, I think with B-52s, of Tokyo was higher than that of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Now, in the long term, of course, radiation killed more people, I think, but staggeringly horrifying people. Now, there's an emperor too. It wasn't like Japan was this wild, big-ass democracy. At least Hitler was voted into power, so the Germans could be conceived of having some responsibility for what happened. So what happened was they bombed the shit out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the Japanese were allowed to keep their emperor anyway. There's still an emperor in Japan. So these fears that, if we let them keep their emperor, they let them keep the emperor anyway. So the Japanese said, we want to surrender. We just need to keep our emperor. They said, no, you can't keep your emperor, unconditional. They bombed the shit out of these two cities, radiation poisoning, staggering, unforgettable fire, all this kind of stuff. And then they let them keep the emperor anyway. So it's completely useless.
Well, yeah, but my original point was that I think that they had reason to believe that
I think they had reason to believe is not an argument. Okay. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. He's the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific. So he would be the guy who would be delivering the soldiers for the supposed invasion of the Japanese mainland, right?
Yes.
He said the Japanese had, in fact, already sued for peace. The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military point of view in the defeat of Japan. The use of atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. Chief of Staff to President Truman in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey said, this is Admiral William D. Leahy, Chief of Staff, certainly prior to 31st December 1945, and in all probability prior to 1st November 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if atomic bombs had not been dropped. Major General Curtis LeMay said the war would have been over in 2 weeks without the Russians entering and without the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb had nothing to do with the end of the war at all. Now, one argument is that they dropped the bomb to scare the shit out of the Russians, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Japan controlled this Manchurian region, and there was like this three-pronged Soviet army attack that was launched against the Japanese-controlled Manchurian region, which had 1.5 million men. I don't know where the hell all these Russian soldiers come from, and after 2 world wars, they got to be cranking them out like toothpaste. But so Japan's army just lasted 3 more weeks, and so that is sort of one argument as to why. But given that they surrendered all of Eastern Europe anyway, I'm not really sure what the point of all that was. It's geopolitics is the very best option, or very best way, or this sort of Jupiter complex, as it was called, the Allied bombing. It just bomb the shit out of people who you're at war with, because it sort of feels better, and is
Yes, Bomber
2003,
rumor about
right?
that.
Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis burned up and killed, short term and long term. Phony threat of WMDs. 2012, thousands of Libyans and stability of a whole region sacrificed to U.S. politics and all that kind of stuff. So this idea that it was necessary to drop these bombs is, I'm going to go with the deep experts at the time and with the historical facts that are clearly in the record. But of course, it's very tough. It's very tough for America and for American students to look at this kind of decision and say, well, America decided to irradiate people for no particular point when the war was already over, fundamentally, when Japan had already sued for surrender, and when the terms that the Japanese wanted for surrender ended up being accepted by the U.S. anyway, then the bombing was unnecessary. So it's hard for Americans to look at that decision and feel a lot of pride in that kind of decision. I think that's one of the reasons why. I mean, I heard this when I was a kid too. The invasion of the Japanese mainland would have cost so many American lives and so on. And no one ever told me, until I looked it up myself years later, no one ever told me that the Japanese had already sued for peace in terms that the U.S. had eventually accepted anyway. So, Tokyo Fire Department. This is the one raid, 97,000 killed and 125,000 wounded. Astonishing. Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department established a figure of 83,793 dead, 40,918 wounded, and close to 300,000 buildings and homes destroyed. That's just one raid over Tokyo. So the idea that, if we kill a lot of Japanese, they'll surrender in one night, almost 100,000 killed, 125,000 wounded, with no nukes. So the idea that you needed to drop a bomb, they just did this in one night anyway. So it's not quite as bad in the short run, and radiation poisoning in the long run. It wasn't like you needed to use these nuclear weapons because they already had basically free reign over Japanese airspace. The counter the AA guns and the fighters were almost non-existent at this point. So they had free reign over Japanese airspace. They could bomb the shit out of anyone they wanted. They could kill 100,000 people, wound 125,000 more, and destroy nearly 300,000 buildings and homes in one night without the use of nuclear bombs. So there was no question the Japanese knew that the game was over before. And there's another historian who puts the deaths at over 100,000. His name is Richard Rhodes. Japanese deaths in one night, over 100,000, injuries at 1 million, and homeless residents at 1 million. So, no, there was no need for the nuclear weapons whatsoever, unless you feel that somehow Japanese civilians should be killed because it scares the Russians, when the Russians pretty much took all of Eastern Europe anyway.
It seems bizarre that the Truman administration would take that measure and then agree to something with essentially no change. Like, I'm trying to mentally picture what his thought process was doing that.
Why?
Yeah.
Why does it matter?
It's just interesting.
I'm not sure why.
Well, it's interesting to consider what his thought process was. If he, obviously, he was willing to agree with a little bit of pressure put on to the original peace terms, right? Because those are the ones he accepted. But the idea that he would do this and to essentially no avail, that's
Jesus. I mean, did you not notice that George W. Bush invaded Iraq and has caused the death of probably close to 1 million people with no justification whatsoever? And haven't you noticed that before that, and Madeleine Albright celebrated this, they had an embargo against Iraq that murdered, caused the death directly of 500,000 children in a population of 30 million?
Well, it's not new to me. It's just
that would be like releasing a virus in America that killed 5 million children.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that this is something new in geopolitics, or this is new in government. I mean, who knows what the fuck these people think, and who cares? Let's just look at the morality of the events and the outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's a hole with no bottom. You can't possibly ever know what went through his mind. Was he a sadist? Did he believe it was necessary? Who cares? It was not necessary. He didn't even consult with some of his major military leaders. He was president, right?
Yeah.
He's got no goddamn right to make massive decisions involving the deaths of largely innocent Japanese, largely women and children, because the men had all been splashed into the side of American warships through kamikaze deaths. And so, yeah, you could say, well, the women and children, the women raised the guys who ended up, but it was a dictatorship. Mm-hmm. We don't hold the victims of a dictatorship responsible for the actions of the dictator. Yeah, no. And the idea that this was necessary is false. It means that hundreds of thousands of innocent people were murdered through nuclear weapons, through irradiation, after a war that the US provoked by creating a civilization strangling embargo around Japan. And again, Japan, bunch of assholes too. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not like, Japanese government was only trying to no, they were in there raping the hell out of Chinese women many ways. And their behavior when they captured prisoners of war. Dear Lord, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. You just want to read up some of the descriptions of how they tested chemical and noxious and biological warfare on concentric rings of Western prisoners. They were incredibly brutal.
Unit 731, was it called? Do you know? It was some
I don't know.
Numbers.
I've read some of this stuff. I don't go that deep into it because I feel helpless in the face of evil that's distant in the past. I don't feel helpless in the face of evil that is to come because we can turn the wheel against that stuff. The evils in the distant past that to some degree have been reformed. And the evils in the distant past, I can only stomach so much of that stuff. It's like, rewinding and watching the death of a loved one you can't do anything about. There's something becomes masochistic after a while. And I'd rather work to prevent future accidents than dwell on the horrors of the past.
Yeah. But no, I'm trying to find the words to describe the it's such a waste that you would go through all of that to nothing. That's because if there actually was no substantive difference between the peace treaties, as you say, then probably, there wasn't a real reason to use the nuclear weapons. I'd have to agree with you on that one.
Well, and it's hard to say because I heard this argument, they wanted to scare the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
During the entire negotiations with Russia that were occurring at Yalta, I mean, FDR loved Uncle Joe Stalin. He was handed over things left, right, and center.
Yeah,
he handed over Poland. Now he was being advised by a Soviet spy, as it turned out, because McCarthy was right, as I talked about in The Truth About McCarthyism recently. But the idea, the Russians were enemy. We had to show them who was boss. It's but they were negotiating with them they were haggling over a cracked China set at a garage sale at Yalta, not too far previous. And so the idea that they wanted to scare the Russians and scare the Russians back is they just handed over millions of people into Soviet domination because FDR thought that Joseph Stalin was just this wonderful, wonderful guy. And so I don't believe that for a moment. If I had to hazard a guess, I would put it down to mass murdering sadism and little more and little less.
Yeah, there was one strategic difference between, I think, the first cry for peace and the second, which was that Russia had actually invaded the Japanese islands at the time of the bombing, but it still doesn't make a lot of sense to me that the United States we would bomb them, accept the first peace treaty out of some sort of haste, because still I feel that we would have had let me put this like this. Okay. Rather than sort of thinking aloud, to posit this, to play a devil's advocate and hear your opinion. So at the time of when the bomb dropped, the Russians had invaded minor outlying northern islands of Japan. And perhaps it was the U.S. government's idea that after the bombing, they wanted to rush to the negotiating table and say, listen, we will accept those original peace treaties because we really don't want a second Korea situation in Japan. What do you think of that?
Again, I mean, these are speculations that can't lead anywhere. I'll tell you two basic facts, though, that are important to remember. So we talked about the bombings in Tokyo, which were horrendous enough that one night. And again, we've got estimates of 100,000 killed. The two bombings, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killed 129,000, right? Two together, right?
Yes.
Now, before the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear bombings, how many Japanese cities do you think had been utterly destroyed by conventional firebombing?
I would suppose quite a lot. I don't know much about the Japanese number, but I know an inordinate amount of German cities were destroyed.
Well, they had destroyed 67 Japanese cities by this point. And the 129,000 people killed, that's a low estimate, right, for the two bombings. Could be well north of 200,000. But they'd already destroyed 67 cities by this point. So the idea, I mean, Japan was basically on fire from end to end. The people had nothing to eat. The sanitation systems, the plumbing, the electricity, all had been destroyed in 67 cities. 67 cities. Mm-hmm. And they weren't going for the little cities. They were going for the big ones. So that's number one. So Japan knew that the Japanese government knew that the gig was up. There was no way.
Yeah.
Now, so they already offered to surrender. They said, we just want to keep the we just want to keep the emperor. Now, one of the reasons, I don't know why, but I would guess one of the reasons why they wanted to keep the emperor was partly to save face, but also partly because they may have been concerned that the emperor would simply have ordered all the Japanese to fight to the death. And since the emperor was given to them by God, then they would have had to do that. And so having the emperor remain on the throne may have been the price so that the emperor wouldn't order everyone to fight to the death, because that's what they had to do in Germany, right? In Germany,
yes,
Hitler ordered everyone to fight to the death, and you had like 10-year-old kids with BB guns going out there and getting their heads blown off and so on, right? So it was horrible. So this is number one. Now, number two, the time span between these two bombings was 3 days. 3 days. Now, think about this. You're the Japanese government. It's the end of a brutal war. I don't know when the last time Japan was invaded, but I don't think it was very often. So this is a completely new thing. This is it's a whole new thing. I mean, Russia, every time they wake up, they were getting invaded, which is why they got a little pissed off at Europe as a whole and probably have some ambivalent feelings about European problems at the moment. But anyway.
Like the concept we have of a typhoon is the Japanese believe they're protected by God because no one's ever mounted a successful land invasion until just recently, which, of the nuclear bombing, of course.
Right. Even able to stave off migrants. Anyway, so the Japanese government, the whole country is in array. They've received, obviously, massive physical damage, countless deaths. The medical system is completely overwhelmed. They can't feed their people. It's a hellscape, and this is a country that has not been invaded successfully in living or dead memory. And 67 cities are destroyed. 67 cities destroyed. Think of the top 67 U.S. cities sorted by population destroyed, and it's a hell of a lot bigger America than Japan. Now, then imagine this. They drop a bomb. You don't know what the hell it is. England knew. England, actually, the British government approved it, and it's what outlined in the Quebec Agreement. But you don't know. There's just some weird bomb, and you don't know. How do you not know? Because everyone's dead, or dying, and there's no communications in or out. So you don't even know what the hell happened to Hiroshima.
Yeah, you
don't know what the hell happened. Let me finish. You don't know what the hell happened to Hiroshima, and then. You have a couple of days which you're supposed to figure out what happened, go and assess the damage, try and figure out what kind of weapon has been dropped, and then you're supposed to change everything and sue for some sort of new peace. You can't do that in 2 days. You just can't. You can't even figure out what the hell happened in 2 days. You fly over the city, you look down and you see a giant crater with nuclear shadows all up. You don't know what the hell has happened. Just one of the most, the most unholy weapons blast in the history of humanity has happened. You don't know what the hell's happened. How the hell are you supposed to assess the damage, figure out your battle plan, or your change in battle plan, or your change in negotiations, and communicate it to the Americans? And you don't know. Mm-hmm. Before you've had a chance to assess the damage in Hiroshima, boom! Nagasaki melts into the sky. So if this was a weapon designed to compel the Japanese to do something, I don't think the Japanese had time, because this was a weapon utterly new in the history of humanity, to assess the damage and figure out what the hell they were going to do.
Well, that makes sense.
So it was 250,000 unnecessary murders, perhaps, and radiation sickness, mutations, birth defects that lasted for decades.
Yes.
Still people alive dealing with the radiation sickness of these bombs. And it turned the page in human history, because these weapons had never been used before, and they were used unnecessarily for the first time on non-military targets against a country that had already surrendered, according to the terms that surrender was finally accepted. And that's why I say, not so much necessary.
That makes sense.
Good. All right. Well, thanks very much for the call. I appreciate it.
Could I
move on to the next caller? And I do like me the history topic, so feel free to call back.
Oh, but could I ask you, I really would like to read more about what you said there was the original peace treaty. Do you have a, like, was that in a book that you read, or did you hear that somewhere?
You're a young man. Just use your webfoo and find it. It took me about 10 minutes. So you can just do a search for it. I'm sure you can find it. But thanks very much for your call. I'm going to move on.
Have a nice day, Stefan.